We all remember the GFC, whether we were educated about it or whether we lived through it. It was a very scary time. Everyone seemed to be going bankrupt, and it was a very scary time for any investor who held American assets. And out of those investors who were holding American assets, the Chinese government was actually amongst those very nervous investors. And what were they specifically invested in? And so they were two struggling US mortgage lenders. They were known as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And there's about $5.4 trillion that were at risk at the time. And out of that 5.4 trillion, it is speculated that the Chinese government had approximately up to 1.7 trillion of that. So that is an incredible risk. And note that I didn't say million or billion, I said a trillion. And the fact that this was of concern for the Chinese also made it a concern for the US Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, because he knew that if the Chinese were to panic sell, it would then cause a domino effect that would basically be a death sentence to those two mortgage providers, which would then cause massive amounts of carnage to the US economy. I mean, you could even speculate that such damage could even remove the USA as the world's #1 economic superpower. And so, I think it's a bit of an understatement to say that the stakes were pretty high during this low point of the global financial crisis. So basically, Hank was pleading with his Chinese counterparts saying, please don't sell, we'll make this okay, we'll make this work. And the Chinese are naturally stressing about losing their $1.7 trillion. And but the Chinese put a bit of pressure on Hank to say, well, no, you need to put some kind of financial backstop on this situation, otherwise we may actually pull out. So fix this or we're out. Anyway, time went by. It was a miserable time for Hank. It was a miserable time for the US government that was trying to deal with the global financial crisis, and it was a stressful time for every single investor in the world. And now let's fast forward to September 2008. So in order to save the $5.4 trillion issue, the Obama administration issued a $116 billion bailout. This would be enough to keep the mortgage providers stable enough not to be on the brink of bankruptcy. So as soon as the bailout was done from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, there was a huge sigh of relief from Hank, from the Chinese investors, and from the NSA operators listening in on that phone call. But this is where the story becomes really interesting. Now that he knew that everything was alright and everything was sorted, he decided to call up his Chinese mates. When he called them up, he had a very interesting conversation. And please note that I'm paraphrasing a lot of how this conversation went. So Hank called up the Chinese and then he said, hey mate, see all your investments are safe, just wanted to check that you got the memo and that you don't need to be panic selling and everything's all groovy. And then the Chinese replied saying, oh mate, love your work, everything's great. Yeah, we'll stick with you. If our money's safe, you don't have to worry about us pulling out. And Hank said, well, glad to hear and glad everything worked out and look forward to working with you guys in the future. Anyway, chat later. And the Chinese counterpart said, well, hang on mate, actually I probably should tell you something that you probably deserve to know. Okay, yeah, go ahead. Hank's Chinese counterpart pointed out that at the low point of the global financial crisis, when everything was down at its lowest point and looked like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were about to go under, and before Obama announced that bailout, the Russians actually approached the Chinese and proposed an idea. They said, while the American markets are down at the lowest point and they've got no money to spare to save anyone or bail anyone out, how about that both Russia and China together sell not only all of our assets in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but any assets that we're willing to sell in the American market all at the same time to crash the American market even further at its low point, and then they'll basically remove the United States as the supreme superpower of the world, hence rising up China and Russia. And fortunately, China actually said no to this deal. And the Russians by themselves, they did not have enough of an investment in the American markets to inflict the damage that they're hoping to do. And so they abandoned the plan. And if this plan had been executed, I mean, we'd still be feeling the effects of this today. And not only in the United States, but in Europe and Australia, and basically every country in the world will be feeling the effects of it. And so I'm actually very relieved that the Chinese actually chose not to take that pot shot when they had the opportunity. And yes, I know you can argue to say that such an attack may have hurt the Chinese more than what it would have hurt the Americans, and you can also argue that the Chinese, if you look at current projections, the Chinese are going to be the world economic superpower anyway. So while they risk rocking the boat and causing turbulence and chaos, if they're going to be rising up to the #1 position anyway. And those two are very valid motives for why the Chinese probably may have said no to this financial attack against the United States. They also may have said no to it because it's the wrong thing to do. I'm more talking about this not from the point of view to say that China saved us, but just the amazement that Russia really tried to take this full-on blown pot shot. And remember, this is back in 2008. This is even before Crimea happened. So you can even argue that this could have been the opening shot in the new Cold War that we're facing today. But the thing I find most interesting about this story is that it shows everyone's intentions. When the chips were down, you can find out what everyone's real intentions were. But it sort of gets us questioning as to why would Russia do such a thing. And so I decided to take a bit of a closer look at Russia and their economy. So as of 2021, Russia's GDP was only slightly larger than my home country's GDP, Australia. Neither of us are even in the top 10 in the world. We're both smaller than Canada, Italy by themselves. And so the Russian economy isn't exactly the powerhouse that one would assume that it would be. And so you can argue that maybe Russia wanted to do this is because they actually want chaos, they want to rock the boat, they want turbulent things to be happening, because that is the only hope that they actually have in rising the world rankings and economic size. The only way that they can go up is to make other players go down. Anyway, thanks for watching and see you next week.